Today is September 29, 2020, which means it's time for another episode of Legends of Garaaga. Hello, Fiendlings, how the hell are you? My apologies for the inconsistency of content of late, but I'm working 2 contracts, trying to finish a novel, record a novel, and stay healthy at the same time. It's getting difficult to juggle all that. I spent last week in the Lake Travis area because that's where our robot shop is. Hours upon hours upon hours of coding, testing, troubleshooting, you know, the usual. Also, upgrading can really suck. What I can tell you is that I'm learning more ROS, Robot Operating System, every time I go up there or have time to actually study. If you have ever been interested in buying a cheap drone and programming it, ROS is probably the solution you're looking for. Along those lines, I want to evangelize for a moment about programming. I've been using Python for the last year and a half, and I can say without a doubt it is the best language for rapid development with hardware, such as robots. Also, it's easy to learn and does its best to keep you from shooting yourself in the head, which is kind of important. Also, if you have an iOS device, you can get your hands on a program called PyBoto, which is a fully featured Python installation. You can add libraries and programs via Python's normal package manager and play all you want. You have to set up absolutely nothing. It's perfect if you want to play with Python. Oh, and I'm also not sponsored by PyBoto. Let's not make that mistake. However, when I was brain blown and couldn't figure out a problem, I sat at the kitchen table at the remote office and solved the issue in 10 minutes on my iPad. I ended up paying the $10 for the full version of PyBoto. It's damn well worth it. There are, of course, dozens and dozens of programs and free websites out there for you to explore learning about software development, how computers work, and the means to create your own programs. Might be better than watching the TV. Now, there is some writing news. I wrote the ending for the Derelict Saga. That's right, the motherfucking ending. Almost 10,000 words to cover it, but there it is. Now I know where I'm going and how all this is going to end. I just have to get the rest of the story there. To be honest, I can't wait to reach that point where I can type the very last word, have a bottle of scotch, and then begin editing and recording. Getting the Derelict Saga done has been a 5-year journey thus far. The fact that it's a single continuous story is a huge milestone for me. The most complex plot, the most complex mix of characters, and my first real future sci-fi tale. It doesn't sell worth a shit, and I won't be able to publish the last 2 novels until I get my rights back. But all that is just so much dark matter in a sea of the real stuff. I'm proud of it. That's all that fucking matters. If you're jonesing for more Derelict, be patient. It's coming. With that, it's time for us to travel back through time where there is no Soul Federation, AIs, exosolar creatures, and definitely no flechette rifles. Back to the library. Be safe, have a great week, and we'll talk again real soon. Here's episode 17 of Legends of Garaaga.
Someone was screaming. The sound was close. After a moment, Herodo realized it was him. His throat burned and his eyes flew open. Akkad was standing at the foot of the bed, his face filled with shock and worry. "My boy," Akkad whispered. "Are you all right?" Herodo stared at his patron. "The hand. The word." "What?" "A fire. A jostle of panicked bodies." "The fire. Akkad, are we safe? Are we—" "We are fine," Akkad smiled. "Both Ptolemy's men and the Centurions kept the library safe. They doused the fire with our help." "But are they still fighting?" "Of course. The fire was their common enemy. Once the street was cleared, they formed up and returned to battle." Akkad leaned in. The smile disappeared from his face. "But you, my boy, are you all right?" Herodo looked around the room. The infirmary was empty save for the 2 of them. My head hurts." "And by the sound of it, your throat." Akkad lifted a silver cup to Herodo's lips. "Drink slowly," he commanded. Cool water dribbled into his mouth. Herodo let the liquid gather and then swallowed. The burning in his throat rose to a crescendo and then abated to a low ache. "Thank you," he whispered. "More?" Herodo shook his head. "What happened?" Akkad grinned. "You fell, and I think someone kicked you." "Yes, I think someone did." The older man patted Herodo's leg. "You rest," I can't have my best scribe brain-addled. Akakios rose and turned. Sir? Yes, Erido? Have you had a chance to read my scrolls? The translations, I mean. Akakios shook his head. No, I've not. I need to speak with Cleotus. Not now, you don't, the old man sighed. Master Cleotus is a little busy at the moment trying to calm the scholarly horde. Erido laughed and regretted it. His throat felt as though it was full of stones. How long have I been out? Akakios shrugged. It is midday. Many hours, my friend. You rest now, Akakios said, and tucked a blanket around his ward. There is time enough for talk of work. For now, you must rest. Rest, Erido repeated, and closed his eyes. He was asleep before Akakios left the room. Erido shivered. Tablets covered his table. The scroll was nearly full. He stared down at the Greek words. Garaaga's children make monsters in their father's visage. They feed on us. They walk our land as our brothers and sisters until it is time to consume. We are their prey. We are their herd. And they have only our slaughter in mind. Rashim's words as told to the first keeper. Triani had faithfully written Easton's story, including the young man's death at the hands of an evil merchant. We need fear those who worship the dark god, Triani had written. The supplicants are as dangerous as the god's children, and far more numerous. I shall write no more. I shall endeavor to keep these words hidden among the tomes until my death. As long as the merchant and his men wander the city, I will stand watch over Nabu's gift and ensure they are not destroyed. As long as I have breath, I shall whisper the names of Rashim, Eason, and Gujaratine. The last tablet had no words written upon it. A symbol was carved in the clay, the same symbol as in the dream. Worship the dark god, Erido muttered. There would be no more tablets for him to translate from Triani. The man's tale was done. Erido stood from the bench and felt the ripple of his spine readjusting. The hall was quiet and empty. He rolled up the scroll and walked to the sorting bin. His hand reached forward to place the scroll with the others and stopped. We need fear those who worship the dark god. He placed the scroll in his belt instead. A flush of shame rose to his cheeks. Mistrust. After all the library had given him, he was loath to place this one in the archives. The story would be incomplete. Later scribes would not know how it ended. But the need to keep this one scroll above the hundreds, perhaps thousands he translated, was overpowering. Betrayal, a voice said in his mind. Betrayal of Akakios, of the library. It didn't matter. Triani had died to keep the story safe. Could he do the same? Erido stared down at the clay tablets, the last remnants, the last pieces of Triani's account. He picked them up and headed toward the store hall. The torches and braziers had been faithfully lit. There was nothing to fear, and yet he shivered just the same. The dream's shadowy figure entered his mind. Garaaga's shadow reaching out and destroying the man who wrote these tablets. Had Triani died like that? Had the lapis merchant and his men murdered him? It was impossible to know. He entered the storeroom. There were still more tablets lining the shelf. He replaced the final 3 Triani tablets and picked up the next in line. He took one look at it and sighed. Unless the librarians had incorrectly sorted the inventory, and that was a rare occurrence indeed, Triani had been true to his word. One look at the uneven cuneiform imprints was all the proof he needed. This scribe wasn't half as gifted or as committed to his work. He pushed the tablet back into place. He yawned. His head ached. Akakios had told him to stay in bed for the day, sip water, and sleep. Instead, he'd headed to Scribe Hall as soon as he was able. He wiped a sheen of sweat from his forehead. Erido looked back at the shelf of tablets. Triani had scribed 723 tablets, 723 clay slabs recounting floods, market days, strange storms, lights in the sky, rituals, and harvest seasons. All until the last 33. From then on, it was Eason, Gujaratine, and Rashim. How many scrolls had he inked as he translated? Herodo touched the one in his belt. 278 scrolls had been interred by the librarians, all of them except this last. He closed his eyes. Greek letters flashed in his mind. Triani's cuneiform turned into a language the learned of the modern world could grasp. And Herodo remembered every word, every letter. I feared you would be here. Herodo stiffened and then turned to stare into Akakios' wizened face. Where else would I be, patron? Akakios scratched at his white speckled beard. I certainly thought I would find you still in the infirmary. Herodo smiled. I had to finish. The old man's brows raised. And did you? Yes. Akakios let out a peal of laughter and raised his hands in supplication. By all the gods, it's about time! The old man clapped him on the shoulder. You are certain? Unless there's been a catalog mistake, Tupsuro's words are no more. You mean Triani? The same, Herodo whispered. He turned to stare at the shelves lined with the ancient tablets. I am done with him. You sound sad. I am, Herodo said. I had hoped there would be more. Something. For a moment, neither man loosed a sound save for their breathing. Come, you must be famished. The dining hall will be closed. Not to me, Herodo. Never to me. The old man led the scribe out of the storeroom. They walked through the hall. For the first time in his life, Herodo despised its emptiness. As they passed his workstation, he lingered. He placed his index finger in the clay dust and drew Garaaga's symbol. A sudden deep chill shot down his spine. Herodo? Akakios asked in a low whisper. Coming, sir, he said in a shaking voice. He placed his palm atop the symbol and wiped it away. I'm right behind you. He turned his back and forced himself to follow his master. Alexandria was rarely warm, at least when compared to the rest of Egypt. Its placement gave it a temperate climate that was always cool and almost always with a breeze. Herodo had placed 2 blankets across his legs, but he still felt cold. Akakios had been true to his word. They talked while Herodo ate dried fish, fruit, and unleavened bread. His master asked question after question about Triani and about the legend found in the last few tablets. The old man's eyes sparkled and his foot tapped in excitement. Herodo, exhausted and empty, droned on for what seemed like hours. By the time he'd finished his meal, the bells had rung, calling for curfew. Herodo finished the story, repeating Triani's last words. The scroll in his belt felt heavier. What would Akakios make of his holding on to the last scroll, the symbol that he had so painstakingly copied from the clay tablet? So Eason made a convert out of Triani. Yes, the last keeper created yet another keeper. Akakios nodded. And now we are keepers as well. Herodo cocked his head and then smiled. The keepers existed to ensure the legend lived on. Despite how the world around them changed, the legend had to be kept intact. There is but one missing piece, then. Yes. Will you ask, or should I? Herodo parted ways with his patron in the dormitory hall and headed to his cell. His tunic was stained with clay dust, but he didn't care. Instead of taking it off, he climbed into the bed and threw blankets over himself. The moment he lay on the straw mattress, he closed his eyes. Sleep tried to embrace him, but failed to consummate. Every time he neared the dreamland, the same thought would light his mind anew. The book. The leather book with its strange Sanskrit on the left pages, the runic writing on the right. ink so crimson it looked as fresh as the day it had first touched parchment. Or so it had been described. Triani's story did not mention any such tome, but that made sense. After all, Nerital's soldiers hadn't encountered it for another 1700 years after the ancient scribe's death. If Philus's account had been true, the book would be in the Alexandrian treasure room, or the pit, as it was affectionately called. Only the head librarian could authorize entrance. And in a few hours, Herodotus would call on Cleotus to discuss it. Akakios had offered to attend the meeting and ensure passage, but Herodotus was adamant he discussed the matter in private. The book. Each time he thought of it, he couldn't dispel the image of Akakios' excited eyes and anxious face. Tupsuro had hardly been Herodotus' greatest achievement. His translations of Gilgamesh and the sacred Ishtarian Bible had required weeks of study. He had learned Akkadian very quickly, but the Sumerian symbols of those two tomes had been written by high priests. They were different than the common Akkadian, and it had taken certain leaps of faith to even attempt a translation. Akakios had been so pleased with those two feats that he had proclaimed Herodotus the greatest scribe that ever lived, at least in private. But that evening, Akakios looked more excited than Herodotus had ever seen the man. His stoicism was legendary, and he rarely gave the scribes more than a nod of approval. Cleotus was a clownish man when compared to his patron. Herodotus turned over in his bed. His back ached, and so did his head. No matter his desperation for sleep, it would not come. The cuneiform symbols from the tablets, the Greek words he'd made from them, floated in his mind. Word for word, he could remember each symbol, each line, each delicate stroke of Triani's stylus, and the Greek word that followed. The scroll he had taken from the library, the scroll with Garaaga's symbol, lay beneath his pillow. He raised a hand to touch it. It felt warm and soothing. At last, he felt he could sleep. The soldiers had decided to take the night off, or so it seemed. Alexandria slept as it had before the war had descended. Only the shiplights from Ptolemy's navy were out of place. Herodotus snuggled against the pillow, one hand wrapped around the brass scroll ends. The tablets, the scrolls. Now only the book remained. The dark forest floor was obscured by overgrowth. Barely able to see with the crescent moon's wan light struggling through the canopy, he moved forward on naked feet. The spear in his hand seemed a part of his arm, as though it had always been there. Ever since his father placed it in his hands, it had become just another part of him. He closed his eyes and concentrated. The jungle appeared in phosphorescence, no longer dark or foreboding. The animals around him were lit up in his imagination. He smiled and continued walking forward, eyes still closed. The brambles seemed to part before him, the fronds swishing across his skin. Their cool moisture soothed him, quieting the nervous tension in his stomach. The cave, he thought. The beast is waiting for me in its cave. Herodotus took the stairs down into the pit. While most of the library sat atop a thick stone foundation, the pit had been the first structure built and was closest to the sea. Pitch and tar sealed it from the elements, and it had supposedly never flooded. The torch in his hands should have warmed him. Instead, the cold stone walls left him shivering. With each step, the air seemed colder. He could see his breath condensing in the air around him. As soon as he'd awakened from the strange dream, he donned a fresh tunic and headed to Cleotus's office. The old librarian had been seated behind a marble table, reading. "Good morning, young man. I trust you're feeling better?" "Good morning, sir. Yes, thank you." Cleotus did not look up from the scroll. "To what do I owe the pleasure of your company?" "I wish to visit Alexander's treasure room." The old man's eyes flashed upward to him. His lips curled in a thin smile. "You do?" Herodotus nodded. He placed the scroll on the table and tinted his hands. I assume there is something in particular you are looking for. The book, from Philus's account. Cleopas grinned. Then you have finished your translations. Yes, sir. The librarian rubbed his hands together. His weathered and chapped skin rustled like dead papyrus stalks in the wind. I am interested in reading them. The scribe licked his lips. Most should already be catalogued. Most? I finished them last night. Cleopas nodded. And why do you wish to see the book? To complete the story, the connections. What Philus described in his account may be the missing link to the religion. Garaaga, the librarian muttered. Yes, it must be a Bible, something like our holy book. Cleopas laughed. Garaaga's very own Torah, eh? Herodo said nothing. The man sighed. I meant no offense, young man. None taken. You believe this book is the key to the rest of the history? Yes. And what if it's not? What if it's nothing more than cooking instructions? Herodo smiled. Then I shall at least know what they ate. The old man let out a peal of laughter. He moved to the side of the table and brought out a fresh sheet of papyrus. He unrolled it and took a pen from the ink reservoir. You shall need an introduction to Varsish. He is the head guard. I doubt the man ever leaves his post. Cleopas scratched out Greek letters on the papyrus. He signed it with a flourish, blew on the ink, and then rolled it up. He dipped his signet ring into wax and then stamped a seal across the document. He handed it to Herodo. Good hunting. As he rounded the staircase, Herodo heard muttered voices below. Ptolemy's men would be there. While Caesar's centurions guarded the library floors above, only the royal guard were allowed in the pit. Even after the hostilities had broken out, Caesar's men showed respect to the guards and did not dare interfere with them. Once they came into view, he didn't doubt why. 3 obsidian-skinned men stood in front of a heavy wooden door. Thick gold necklaces, filigreed with Osiris's image, hid their necks. Wide golden cuffs covered their forearms. Each man held a curved blade in his hands. Several torches and braziers lit the area. The gold gleamed and sparkled beneath the wavering flames. The metal blades appeared suicidally sharp. The tall, muscled men eyed him as he stepped into view. The largest of the 3, painted glyphs covering his skin in blues and reds, stepped forward. What business do you have? The man asked in Greek. The accent was thick, but the pronunciation was flawless. Herodo swallowed. He pulled the scroll from his tunic and outstretched his hand. The large guard held out 2 fingers and gently pulled it from his shaking arm. He unrolled it and stared. His lips moved as he read the Greek. He nodded to himself and handed back the scroll. Pass, the man said and stamped his foot. The other 2 guards stepped away from the entrance. The large man turned and opened the door. You've brought nothing to write on. No, sir. The man laughed in derision. No writing, only study, and mind your torch. Herodo nodded. Stay as long as you like. Knock on the door when you are ready to depart. He nodded again and walked through the tall doorway. He took a few steps inside. The rectangle of bright light from the chamber shrank as the door slammed behind him. A lock clicked into place. Herodo's torch seemed to barely penetrate the darkness. Filthy Jew, you'll die here! The children's voices rang in his skull. He felt hands of shadow reaching for him. He shook. The torch's dancing flame carved amorphous shapes in the darkness. A pair of eyes gleamed at him. Herodo closed his eyes. Nothing here, he told himself. Nothing. He opened his eyes. The 2 gold circles in the darkness were still there, unblinking. He slowly turned and hummed to tune out the yelling children. Die! Die! The thing in the darkness was watching him. With his back turned, it could be silently stepping forward. The Shadow Guardian would be behind him, ready to rip into pieces. The torch's flame showed in the brazier on the wall. It took him 3 shaking tries to push the flame into the oil. The brazier lit and sparked. Polished black stone reflected the firelight and his image. The eyes glowed behind him. A jet of urine soaked his netters. "Nothing here," he whispered. He turned and stared into darkness. The brazier illuminated a quarter of the room, and Herodot took in a deep breath. A gold mask hung on the wall. Amber-jeweled eyes stared from its emotionless face. He let out the breath. The voices in his head had disappeared, as had the crushing fear. He walked to the other side of the door and lit the opposite brazier with more sure hands. Shadows dissolved beneath the light. The room was filled with gold, silver, and bronze relics. A bejeweled elephant's head sat in one corner of the room, its eyes empty and lifeless. Relics hung from the walls. Strangely shaped swords of unknown metal filled weapon stands. Shields of polished gold or bronze reflected the light. Wooden pipes, clubs, and armor filled another stand. Herodot stood in place, his eyes wandering over Alexander's treasures. How many lands had he supposedly traveled to? The Indus, Macedonia, Egypt, Greece, Persia. The treasure room had bounty from every land he'd traveled and bled in. Yahweh only knew how old or from where each piece had been taken. Herodot walked through the long aisles of relics. The light from the front braziers had bathed the entrance and the first aisle, but shadows once again crept in the further he went. He glanced at the walls. Between the stuffed head of a furry creature that was far too large to be a dog and a huge stuffed snake, he saw an unlit brazier. He brought it to life, and the shadows dissolved once more. Another aisle, and another. Whenever the light became too dim, he found another brazier to light. He continued toward the back of the long, wide chamber until he found what he was looking for. Tall wooden shelves rose from the floor. A heavy wooden ladder was leaned against them. Vellum scrolls lined the shelves, their ends made from gold. Herodot stood before them, his eyes searching. The scrolls varied greatly in size. Some were as narrow as he'd ever seen, while others were bloated, their ends round as a fist. He reached for one, and then stopped. He wondered if Cleodas felt like this, struggling to ignore curiosity, the temptation to pull every one of them and study their words, scribe them into Greek from whatever language they were written in. "When you see the shelves of parchment," the library had told him, "they will call to you." He'd held up a finger. "Do not touch what you do not need." Herodot sighed. So much history, yet the Ptolemies allowed nothing to leave the room. This was a shrine to Alexander. It was not to be profaned by scholarly curiosity. He continued down the shelves, his eyes scanning from top to bottom before taking another step. He was on the 5th shelf when he saw a single dark space between the gilded scrolls. With a shaking hand, he reached forward and slid his fingers into the darkness. He expected to feel cobwebs or perhaps the fur of a rodent. Instead, his fingers caressed something cool and pliant. He pulled the object out of the space and stared. 7 crimson-colored symbols stared back at him from the leather cover. He frowned. He knew 8 languages, but these runes were like nothing he'd ever seen before. He rubbed his index finger across them. The cool leather warmed in his hands. Philus's account had been accurate after all. The symbols practically blazed with color, as though they had been inked yesterday. He opened the cover and stared at the first page. Sanskrit marks covered the inside. The right was made more of those strange glyphs. Herodot began to read. The library courtyard was empty. It seemed like years ago that Cleodas had warned the library denizens to remain inside to avoid the bloodshed and chaos in the streets. Herodot hadn't considered disobeying the command until after he'd read the book. He stared off toward the dying sun. The day had disappeared for him. The trip to the pit consumed it. A Torah? Cleodas had mused that morning. No, Herodotus thought. A summoning, laws, and a roadmap to worship. He shivered. He spent hours poring over the tome, translating the Sanskrit in his mind and then memorizing the runic symbol that matched it. There was no way to tell how the language was spoken, of course, but he had absorbed enough of the runes to guess how it was written. His idle hands drew in the sand on the stone bench. The runic symbols appeared beneath his fingers. He wiped it away and began another, all the while repeating the Greek word that went along with it. Sanskrit to Greek, the runes to Sanskrit to Greek. Exhaustion tugged at him. In the last rays of the warming sun, he could easily have lain down and been asleep in moments. There was, however, too much to do. The book was a profanity. It had to be destroyed. After committing the words and runes to memory, he had tried. First in the brazier. It refused to burn. The cover, instead of smoking or catching fire, glowed with an unearthly light. His hands dropped the tome to the stone floor in fear. He'd stood over it for what seemed like hours, afraid to touch it, afraid to leave it. Once he found his courage, he bent down and retrieved it. The cover was still warm, the runes still glowing crimson. He opened the book to the middle and tried to tear out a page, but it resisted. Herodotus even tried to cut the book using a gold-hilted dagger. Still, the pages refused to break or tear. Profanation, something not of Yahweh, something not of this world, and it was hidden in the pit amongst Alexander's treasures. At last he decided to keep it hidden. Instead of placing it back on the shelves as he'd found it, he stored it in the great lion's head statue of bronze and silver. Those who searched for it would not find it where it belonged, and with as many artifacts as the tomb contained, he doubted it would be found at all. Carve the sacred symbol into your flesh. Make your bargain. Serve. He shivered again. The words flashed in his mind, Greek to Sanskrit to rune. As he translated the tome, the chamber had grown insufferably warm. Once he'd finished and closed it, the fetid, cool air returned. Sheol contained nothing like this. The elders at the synagogue never mentioned the word Garaaga or a beast like it. Nephilim, the fallen ones. The Torah mentioned them as the offspring of Yahweh's angels and women, children not of man, and yet walked with him, ruined him, destroyed him. Herodotus looked down at the sand. He'd drawn the symbol from the book, its symbol. He shivered again and wiped it clean. After leaving the pit, he came straight to the courtyard. If Akkios or Cleodas found him, they would no doubt want to know what he discovered. He wasn't certain what to tell them. The cartographer, Archelon, told him not to trust Cleodas. The head librarian provided him with Philus's account. The words of the long-dead soldier had confirmed the link between Traiani's writings and the Indus Valley. Without the Alexandrian period account, he would have written off Garaaga as the scribblings of a madman. Or would I? And what of his patron Akkios? Akkios cannot read Sanskrit, Herodotus muttered. Something didn't make sense. The two men were hardly friends, although they shared meals together at times. Their heated debates were legendary, as was their dislike for one another. Yet in the matter of Traiani's tablets, they seemed allies, pushing him to finish the translations as fast as he could. When he'd asked Cleodas for permission to visit the pit, the old man had hardly interrogated him. Cleodas, Akkios, Archelon. Even after years of service to Akkios, he didn't feel as though he knew the man. His childhood had been consumed by the study of the Torah, Greek, Akkadian cuneiform, Egyptian, hieroglyphics, Latin, and Aramaic. Their time together consisted of each of them with their nose in a scroll, or discussing its creation. Aristotle, Socrates, and Sophocles became his gods. Their logic, their science, even their pagan religion was of more interest to him than his own faith. While he held the book in his hands, Yahweh had never seemed more real to him. If Garaaga existed, so must Yahweh, and so must Nabu and the rest of the Sumerian gods. The Greek gods, too. Or were they all one and the same? They must never know of the book, he thought to himself. No one must know how to summon it. The sound of armor clanking and sandals marching in step filled the courtyard. He looked up to watch a cadre of centurions take positions in front of the burbling marble fountain. The fountain, an old relic carved by one of the first artisans invited to the library, displayed a statue of Apollo stretching his hand toward the sun. The centurions said nothing as they stared toward the street. "Librarian!" a gruff voice called in Latin. Their leader, dressed in red and gold, approached Herodotus. "Get back inside, young man, and head to the dormitory. We are closing off the rest of the library. Nothing good will happen here." Herodotus stood. "Is the royal army near?" The centurion grunted and spit a wad of phlegm to the ground. "They are rabble, child. Not an army so much as a mob. We will break them, and we will keep them from you and yours." Herodotus brushed sand from his tunic and sighed. "Good luck, Roman." The centurion smiled and nodded. "Any man breaks," he yelled as he turned to face his troops, "and I'll have your testicles on a spear." "Sir!" the cadre shouted in unison. He watched them for a moment as they stood silent, waiting. The leader hummed as he walked up and down the line. Their great shields caught the last of the sun as it finally dropped below the horizon. Herodotus turned and made his way back into the library.